welcome you all to our author event series here at Brookline Booksmith. Tonight we have the delightful author, Jonathan Ike, and his book, King Alive, and it is a conversation with Randall Kennedy. But before we hear from these brilliant speakers, I have a few notes to give you all. First, we just request that you keep your mobile phones on silent during this event. Also, as this is a sold-out event, I want you to look at your neighbors. If there are any empty seats, please get closer to the center so we can have some room on the sides. And also there will be no standing there in the aisle, so we have a point of egress back there. It doesn't seem like it's a problem now, so we should all be good. The signing will be here at the end, so please line up towards the jewelry table over there if you would like to have your book signed after the event. And if you haven't yet picked up your pre-ordered book, you can find me with my colleague back there handing them out. We also have more to sell, so please come and say hi to us as well. And other than that, I just want to say this event is fantastically hosted in partnership with the Brookline Martin Luther King Day Celebration Committee. And so here for the actual introductions is Bernard Green. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great book. I haven't read it, but people who have say it's fantastic. So I'm Bernard Green. I'm chair of the Brookline Select Board and also the chair of the Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee. Tonight's discussion is one of many that the committee puts on during the year, in addition to our annual event on Martin Luther King's birthday, or the holiday. Many of those events can be seen on video and with other materials on the website of the town at the Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee web page. And I urge you to go see the interesting and expansive things that we've presented over the years. Tonight's discussion with Jonathan Ike and Professor Randall Kennedy, one of the events and programs that we've always tried to use to honor King, but also to understand in a deep and critical way King, his life, his times, and the civil rights movement that he was an integral part of. So tonight's event is particularly relevant to that focus of the committee, in that Jonathan Ike, as I understand, from what people say who have read this book, reveals King as an actual real human being, right? With all the strengths and weaknesses and honors and or distinctions and flaws of all great people. I almost said great men, but I apologize. So this can be very interesting, very informative in ways that we don't usually hear King talk about. I'd like to thank people who've made this event possible. First, the co-sponsor of tonight's event, Brookline Booksmith, and Alex Schaffner, who helped us to organize this program. And Booksmith is an important institution, important intellectual institution in the town of Brookline, where you can browse, touch, read, and buy great books and also listen to great authors talk. Second, I want to thank Margaret Talcott, a Brookline resident and producer of literary events at American Ancestors, a program of New England Historic Genealogical Society. Margaret worked with the MLK committee to connect us with Jonathan Ike, who then suggested that Professor Kennedy interview him. She also connected us with Stephen Wild, Ike's publisher, at Mr. Ike's publisher at Farrar, Straus, and Farrell. And of course, I want to thank the incredible brains behind the MLK committee. Rob Daves, Jack Curtis, yeah, Caitlin Starr, and of course me. So Jonathan Ike is a former senior writer for the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of Ali, A Life, of Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, and Opening Day, Story of Jackie Robinson's First Season, as well as many other books. Ken Burns called him a master storyteller. So we're going to see how accurate Ken Burns is tonight. Randall Kennedy is Martin R. Klein Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He is the author of many books, including Race, Crime, and the Law, for which he was awarded the 1998 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. Randall Kennedy is a member of the American Law Institute, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Association. So with that, let me introduce Jonathan Ike and Randall Kennedy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the very generous introduction, and I'd like to thank all those who participated in making this forum available to us and to all of us. So let's get to it. All right. It's a wonderful book, and to begin with, I'm going to read the very first sentence of the book, and I'm going to ask you to unpack it because it's a quite striking sentence. On December 5th, 1955, a young black man became one of America's founding fathers. What prompted that sentence?
Well, about 6 years of sweat, for one thing. As you can relate, and I have to say, it's just a privilege to be here with a writer who I've admired for a long time. And I wrote a magazine article back in, you probably don't remember this, back in 1996. And you wrote me a letter telling me how much you admired the article, and I still have that letter today. And Professor Kennedy is somebody whose work has always been a guidepost for me, so it's just an honor to be here. And now I could talk for the next hour about that one sentence, but I'll try to keep it brief. One of the things that you try to think about when you decide how to open a book is, what is this book really about? And I'm trying to write a more intimate portrait of Martin Luther King than we have grown accustomed to. My theory being that, especially since the national holiday was created, we've turned him into a monument and we've forgotten the man. So what's the moment at which Martin Luther King faces the decision about what he can do, what he will do with his life? I believe the turning point, this again took about 6 years of sweat thinking about his life and researching his life and interviewing dozens of people who knew King. And I believe the moment when he becomes Martin Luther King as we know him is December 5th, 1955. And you know, and many of you know, that was the day just after Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat on the bus, that the people of Montgomery decided they were going to refuse to ride the buses on Monday. And they came together for a meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church, and they needed somebody to speak to the crowd and to try to rally them, to make sure that people would stick together and not ride those buses, even though it would be tempting the next day, because they didn't know how they were going to get to work. And they asked Martin Luther King Jr. if he would agree to be that person to speak, if he would be the spokesman for the organization. They didn't ask him to become the leader of a movement. They didn't ask him to devote his life to a cause. They just said, would you be the leader of this protest, which might last a day, which might last a week, we don't know. And he was reluctant, because he had just turned down an invitation to join the board of the NAACP in Montgomery because he was too busy. He just had a new baby, he's working on his doctorate dissertation, but he agrees to give this speech. And he stands up in front of the crowd. It's the biggest church in Montgomery. They chose it because they needed space. Thousands of people crammed in the church, and thousands more are outside on the streets. They set up loudspeakers. King arrives. He has 20 minutes to prepare for this speech. And he goes home, tells his wife that he just agreed to do this thing, and he doesn't know if he should have. He goes into his little study in the back of the parsonage on Jackson Avenue. He prepare, and he has a panic attack and loses 10 minutes of his 20. Now he can't even think about writing a speech. He jots some notes, he rushes to the church, and when he gets there, he sees just all this traffic. The streets are blocked for half a mile. He has to get out of his car and walk, and it's as he's walking that he realizes that this is for him. He gets there to the Holt Street Baptist Church. He, according to one account he gave, he said he felt like he had to be carried. There wasn't room for him to walk down the aisle to get to the pulpit. And he begins this speech, and Coretta at the last minute, Coretta can't go because she's has to stay home with the baby, says, make sure someone records the speech tonight. And we don't know if she gave him the tape recorder, we don't know who recorded it, but we have a tape of the speech that night, and you can listen to it on YouTube on your way home tonight. And he says, we're here tonight for serious business. He opens very flatly. He says, we're here tonight, though, to decide if the Constitution is going to really live up to its promises. We're here tonight to prove that our people, the colored people as he calls them, can inspire the nation to be something more than it has been, to overcome all of the faults that it's got, all of the mistakes that it's made. And we are here tonight to see if the words of the Bible really can mean something. And in that moment, he finds his voice. He delivers the message in the way that he will deliver it for the rest of his life, by combining the messages of the Bible and the Constitution, saying, we've been beaten, we've been treated so badly that we have a right to really be angry. We have a right to demand change. We have a right to rebel, but we only want to join this country. We don't want to overthrow it. We want to join it. And in that finding that message, bringing together that hope, that optimism, combining the words of the Bible with the Constitution as our founding fathers did, I believe he becomes a founding father. Because if you believe it, I know you're the legal scholar here, so please, weigh in. If the Constitution is supposed to be a living document, all he's saying is that it's time for that living document to grow and evolve. And I think more than anyone, King brings us closer to making the Constitution live up to the words it promises.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, just 2 lines out of the speech. One, if we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. And then second, and my favorite, and a statement that he made just in his last speech. I mean, your comment about this being a speech that sort of presaged all the other speeches. One of those lines in his speech is, the great glory of American democracy is the right to protest for right. And he said that in April 3rd, 1968, his last speech. That was a big thing with him. So one of the things that you show in your book, and it's sort of striking, his career was 13 years long. A lot went on in those 13 years, but if you had to choose a moment in those 13 years, I mean, you know this life better than anyone at this point. If you had to choose one moment in that 13-year career that was the most admirable moment, what would it be for you?
Wow. I picked this moment, obviously, because I think it's the moment where he is really stepping up. And just like in every great saga and every great movie, the hero has to decide, am I going to step into the breach? But what I love the most about King is that he steps into the breach over and over again. After his home is bombed, after he's stabbed in the chest, after he learns that the federal government is bringing the full weight of his law enforcement powers to destroy him, to destroy his marriage, to prod him to suicide, he steps forward again and again. So if I had to pick one moment, I would pick April 4th, 1967, a year before he dies, when he gives the speech at Riverside Church in New York, and says, it really sums up all of his philosophy, really from showing that he was never all about civil rights. He was about the lessons of the Bible and how they apply to creating a more perfect universe. And that speech brings together everything from race to religion, and he calls America the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. But what's really powerful about that speech is that he is basically saying, I'm not going to be limited to where I've had success before. I'm not going to be cowed by the criticism of the New York Times, which says I should keep my mouth shut about Vietnam. I'm not going to be afraid of losing my relationship with LBJ. I'm going to do what I believe is right. And the day after that speech, one of his best friends calls it, and we know this because the FBI is taping the calls, and one of his best friends says, you know, Martin, I think that was a mistake. And King says, it might have been a political mistake, but it wasn't a moral mistake. And that's probably my favorite King moment.
Wow. He was attacked so harshly. Carl Rowan, the other...
Who was being paid by the FBI. Well, he was being recruited. The FBI was whispering in his ear. I don't know if he was being paid.
I mean, most of the black mainstream civil rights leaders thought it was a mistake.
Yeah.
Even Bayard Rustin thought it was a mistake.
Yeah.
He really went out on his own with that one.
That's right.
So that was the most admirable in those 13 years. at what point were you most disappointed in him as you were working through his life?
I knew this was going to be a good interview. I was disappointed by the way he treated women many times, and not just Coretta. He was very reluctant to let women rise to positions of leadership within the movement, even though there were many qualified women. Coretta had a lot of qualifications that went to waste because King, and not just King, a lot of men of his generation, and certainly Baptist preachers of his generation, grew up in an environment where women's contributions were not appreciated and were not encouraged to the extent they should have been. So certainly, and King was well aware of his own flaws, but there were many moments that were hard for me that I wrestled with in that regard.
I want to stay on this for a minute because, I mean, one of the things that has been written about with respect to your book is the FBI surveillance and other sorts of surveillance that have focused on or have underlined King's extramarital affairs. What was that about? Why? Because he was certainly taking a big risk not only with his own career, but he was taking a big risk with the movement, giving J. Edgar Hoover tremendous leverage that could be used against the movement. What was going on there?
I can't answer the question why he continued to have these affairs when he knew the FBI was listening, when they knew they were following him around, when they were taking pictures of him with women in in airport lobbies and in airports and in hotel lobbies. I don't know why he felt like he couldn't stop, but I will say, just looking at it over the longer haul, I've interviewed one of his best friends from elementary school all the way through high school, knew him all his life. She went on to become a sex therapist and researcher at Masters and Johnson, and she was uniquely qualified, I think, because her sister was also dated. Her sister had dated King. Her best friend was engaged to King. She said, ML, as she called him, was deeply disturbed by the fact that his father had affairs with women, and that even as a young boy, as 13, 14, he would talk to his friend June and say, "I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to be like my dad," because he was horrified by his father's behavior, which people in Atlanta gossiped about. And yet, even at the age of 16, 17, he was juggling women, according to June, and that June said to me he was never monogamous a day in his life. And he had a problem with that, and I think his fame, I think the pressures of his work all contributed to that, but beyond that, it's difficult for me to really explain it.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the difficulties of writing a book like this. I mean, you really took on a heck of a task. I mean, so here you have one of the most prominent people in all of American history. He's a person who had been covered by some wonderful biographies. I mean, David Garrow's, very prize-winning biography. Scholars have written, a mountain of work about King. Were you daunted by the fact that, a lot of people had already done a lot of work on your subject?
Yeah, every day. I'm still daunted by it, but that's part of. I think writing any biography is daunting because you're taking with Lou Gehrig seems like a pretty simple guy to write about, but you're taking someone's life in your hands, and you're asking people to believe that you know what was in his heart and mind. And you don't. You're just reporting and researching the best you can to try to make the best case for that this is a compelling and a convincing version of someone's life story. With King, the stakes were higher because so much good work has been done already, because he means so much to so many people. So I felt like the pressure was greater for sure. And the only way I could sleep at night was just to know that I was working my tail off, traveling around the country, interviewing every single person who knew the man that I could find. Going through archival documents. Some of those people who you mentioned, like Garrow and Taylor Branch, made their archives available to me. I was able to listen to tapes of interviews that they did, including the parts that they didn't use in their books. I found tons of new sources of material. So it had been 25 years since Garrow's book, 40 years, and I don't consider and Garrow doesn't consider his book a straight biography. It's a broader history. The last straight biography of King was 40 years ago. So it was just obvious that we needed a new biography of King, and I've never really felt like I was confident that I could do it, but I felt like I had to try because the opportunity was there, and these people who knew him were still with us, and I wanted to try to interview them while there were still witnesses.
You wrote a wonderful biography of Muhammad Ali. What was it? Compare those two missions.
I had so much fun with Ali because the people were all crazy. The boxing world is nuts. Every single person I interviewed wanted to be paid for the interview. Prices ranging from $1,000 to $6,000 generally, and I didn't pay any of them, just for the record. But Ali was this crazy world of mixed up people, and King world was like beautiful people. Like the saints, just everybody wanted me to stay over. Everybody wanted to cook dinner for me. Like people, it was like the best. It was the angels that I was dealing with, and it was just such a shocking change from boxing world. But they were similar in that way. In that I have this amazing chance. I spent 5-6 years on a book to get to know people who knew these people, and just before we got here today, I listened to a voicemail. I missed a call from Jimmy Bashai, who was King's classmate at Crozer Seminary, and he just got his book, and he was crying, calling me, saying that he was just so thrilled to see his name in the book, and that I went to Jimmy's house in Pennsylvania and stayed with him for 2 nights. He and his wife cooked dinner for me. Like that journey, like to know people who he used to hear King in his dorm room practicing "Let Justice Roll Down Like Water" and "Righteousness Like a Mighty Stream" out the window of his dorm room. Like the opportunity to meet people like that was just off the charts.
Have you encountered thus far any pushback from people who have said you ought not be the biographer of Martin Luther King Jr. because after all you're white?
I haven't yet, to be honest. I was concerned about that, and I've thought about it a lot, and I put a lot of intentional work into making sure I did it the best way I could, because I didn't set out to do it like it happened somewhat organically. I was interviewing people for Ali, like Harry Belafonte and Dick Gregory and Andrew Young and Jesse Jackson, and I just found myself asking them. First of all, I began asking, what was it like when King and Ali met? How did they get along? And then I just naturally sort of gravitated. What was King like? If you have the opportunity to interview Dick Gregory and you don't ask him what was it like to hang around with Martin Luther King, then you're not a very good reporter. I'm a pretty good reporter, and I just began to realize that this was an amazing opportunity to travel the country and interview people who knew King. And then I realized there hadn't been a biography in a long time, and that in that time we had turned him into this very safe figure that he wouldn't recognize, and I don't think he would like. We've kind of watered it down, a lot of his messages. We don't teach his own words other than "I have a dream," and maybe some schools teach "Letter from a Birmingham Jail." So it felt like it was an amazing moment where we needed a more intimate portrait of King that would remind us that this was a guy who had teeth, that he was in many ways more radical than Malcolm X, that by the end of their lives, as James Baldwin said, they were practically indistinguishable in their politics. So that's the kind of book that I wanted to write, and after all of these people like Andrew Young and Dick Gregory and James Lawson and Bernard Lafayette said they would help me, I then went to scholars who might be writing books about King, or who were working on books about King, and asked them if they would help me, because I had a lot to learn, and I offered to share all my research materials, all these new archival finds. So I found myself surrounded by an incredible community of writers and acquaintances of King's. So, to be honest, once that was in place, I never really had any doubts about whether I should do it.
How much did King participate in the writing of the speeches, and in some instances the writings that have made him iconic? So you mentioned "Letter from a Birmingham Jail." We could check this out. We're in a bookstore. You can't have a book of writings about dissent without Letter from a Birmingham Jail. I mean, that has become absolutely iconic. You can't have a book about great speeches in the history of the United States without I Have a Dream. How much did he actually, when you hear these things, when you read these things, he had smart people around him, he had people that were helping him, but how much did he actually participate in the production of these iconic texts?
It's a complicated question. I kind of think of King being like Miles Davis. He didn't have a whole lot of original compositions. He made everything his own. And even Letter from Birmingham Jail, which he obviously wrote in jail, so he didn't have a lot of books around him. He couldn't really plagiarize, which was a habit of his at times. Even that, if you analyze the text, it draws on so many other texts. It draws on things he'd already written. It draws on things he'd read in college. It draws on so many sources, and you find this in a lot of his writing. He did farm out a lot of his work. He had people write first drafts for most of his books. He would assign different chapters to different writers, and then he'd read it all and weave it together, make it his own. And in sermons and speeches, it was much more of his own improvising, bringing things together, repeating parts of sermons. I Have a Dream comes from Langston Hughes, and a lot of the language can be traced directly to Langston Hughes. But when I mentioned the Miles Davis analogy, I think the I Have a Dream speech is a really apt one, because the first half of the speech he'd written out, and it came from a lot of his familiar source material, and it was pretty dry. And then the second half, he decided it's time to improvise. So I'm going to take another chorus, and I'm going to tell you today that I have a dream. And then he goes and he takes the audience to church, and that's where he's most comfortable, and that's where he's most original.
In at least in academic circles, the question of him and borrowing and ghostwriters has gotten a lot of attention. I think your comment about Miles Davis, and one could expand it. I mean, so if we're talking about political figures, if we're talking about judicial figures, I mean, Mr. Civil Rights, the great Thurgood Marshall, absolutely a great person, wonderful lawyer. He certainly had people that helped him, put various things together, however. And certainly if we're talking about political figures, if we're talking about presidents or secretaries of state, these people are not writing, they couldn't. It'd be impossible for them to do that. But sometimes I think when people think about King, there is this, I don't know, the question of plagiarism, as you know.
Well, we know he plagiarized his dissertation, his doctoral dissertation for Boston University, very heavily. And professors, it's shocking if they didn't notice, but they completely let it slide. I discovered that he actually plagiarized the high school speech that he gave in a statewide speaking contest.
Oh, brilliant.
And he actually finished third in the contest. And then to make matters worse, he not only plagiarized, he then went on to say in his memoir that he won the contest. So writing was not his priority. He gave hundreds of speeches a year. He was on the road constantly. The only way the SCLC could really maintain its funding was for him to be out on the road giving speeches. So there was no way he was going to make the time to write them all. He began earnestly as a preacher, writing his own sermons. But even then, the tradition in the church is to borrow from other sermons. So I don't think he saw I don't think he had much concern about it. He had a lot of other things to worry about.
What's your assessment of him as a father?
I think he definitely loved his kids. He was great with his kids, but he wasn't home much. And I think that Coretta complained about it a lot. And at that time, and even in her memoir, she talks about how little she was home. If you look back, you can look through the SCLC's archives and see his schedule, and it would say when he was home. Even when he was home for a week, it was rare for him to be home for a whole week. And even when he was home for a week, he wasn't always staying at home. And the schedule would say staying across town. So staying across town usually meant Dorothy Cotton's place, unfortunately. But that's family dynamic that he had to deal with, that Coretta and the kids had to deal with.
What's your assessment of him as a friend?
Oh man, I think he was a beautiful friend. I think he was especially the people who were traveling with him, who were in the fight, who were with him every day, you know, like Ralph Abernathy, even some of his childhood friends he stayed in touch with. He was just, you know, one of the really nice things about King is that he was a terrific listener. And you think about some of these public figures who don't have time for much of anything but their work. When he was alone, he cared about people and what they were going through. And he would have Sunday dinners, he and Coretta with Ralph and Juanita Abernathy, and that was one of the few places where they could go and really be themselves, and he could put his feet up and relax. But I think, especially with Abernathy, with Stan Levison, I think, you know, he was a very loyal and caring friend, as much as he was, you know, able to focus on that.
I have one more question, and then I'm sure there are folks here who have questions. My last question has to do with his relationship with LBJ and JFK, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. What was the nature of his relationship with those two key presidents that were, you know, so important in his career as a civil rights leader?
There are two parts to those relationships. One is the part in which they're working together on civil rights, trying to get legislation passed. The other part of the relationship is the FBI and how those presidents are managing Hoover, and how Hoover is seeking to destroy King, and what role the presidents played in that. So we have to talk about those two things separately, and of course they come together at many points. But to begin with, I think King is very disappointed with the Kennedy administration. He feels like Kennedy's made a promise when the black voters essentially put him in office, and then once in office, Kennedy was very slow to take any action on the things that he had promised. And King was deeply frustrated by this and criticized Kennedy openly, came to him with what he called the Second Emancipation Proclamation, and asked Kennedy to commit himself to the anniversary of the First Emancipation Proclamation to ending segregation once and for all, and bringing about a new era of race relations in this country, and specifically in the South. And Kennedy wouldn't do it. He was worried about losing votes in the South. He was already thinking about his re-election and worried that he would lose some of those conservative white voters in the South who were still Democrats. And King basically had to go to Birmingham and do what he had to do to get Kennedy's attention enough that Kennedy would have the courage to take up the fight. And that's exactly what he did, and it's you know, one of Kennedy's great speeches when he finally, from the Oval Office, announces that you know, that America needs to handle this. At the same time, the Kennedys are warning him that the FBI, the Kennedys first of all authorized the wiretaps on King's home and office, on the home and offices of his closest advisors. So they're beginning to listen to all of his phone calls. And the Kennedys don't tell him this, but they do tell him that we know that you're associated with communists, former communists, and that it's a great risk. You need to cut these people out of your organization. And King doesn't really understand this. It's one of King's, maybe you could argue it's one of his great flaws, is that he doesn't understand politics. He doesn't understand that if he just cut a couple of his communists loose and shown the Kennedys that he was listening and that he respected their opinions about the danger of having communists associated with the civil rights movement, because they were worried about the politics of it, essentially. They were worried about the optics. And King just couldn't understand that. These were his good friends. These were loyal fighters in the crusade for civil rights. He wasn't going to cut them loose. And that's because he was following a set of moral principles that came from the Bible, not from Machiavelli. And it hurt. And as a result of that, once the wiretaps begin, and it becomes clear that King is not interested in communism, he's on the phone with these former communists talking about how to make America great, how to make America more democratic. That's all they're talking about. But the purpose of the surveillance pivots, and at the same time, Kennedy's assassinated, LBJ takes over. LBJ seems to really like the gossip coming out of these wiretaps, encourages it, and LBJ begins his administration with a wonderful relationship with King. They're on a first-name basis, and Hoover is poisoning that relationship. One of the really big archival discoveries I heard is that LBJ was worried about the fact that he was getting direct personal memos from Hoover about the most tiny and tawdry details of King's life, and especially when he began criticizing the war in Vietnam, really vicious memos, and Hoover ordered his secretary to keep them in his safe, along with his personal documents, along with his financial records, and along with the tapes he was making of all his phone calls. And it was David Garrow who said to me that he thought about checking LBJ's secretary's files at the LBJ library. Nobody had opened them yet. And those files revealed that Hoover was writing to LBJ far more often, and LBJ was writing back encouraging this behavior. It was LBJ who said, we should leak this stuff to the media. We should ask reporters to push King on these questions. So the relationship was being undermined, even as King and LBJ were passing some of the greatest, most consequential legislation in American history. So we have this unbelievable complexity of those relationships, and it's, you've written about this too, and I would love to see, what you think about the fact that this legislation is seen as the greatest achievement of the civil rights movement, but it only went so far and the relationship shattered. And who knows what more King and LBJ might have done with this, perhaps the greatest partnership ever between an activist and a president, and yet it's being, rotted from within by this information.
Others? Questions? Yes, ma'am.
So I'm absolutely fascinated that you went to David Garrow and Taylor Branch to talk to them about their previous biographies. When you
I should mention David Levering Lewis too also shared material, so I should thank him as well.
So when you went, one of them won the Pulitzer Prize.
They both?
Both of them won the Pulitzer Prize. I'm curious as to when you did talk to them, did they give you any indication of what could be discussed at this point in history that you could focus on this or on that? Did they say, try this or try that? And what you're focused on in this book, is it in any way a reflection of our time in America now? Could this not have been something discussed at the time of those previous biographies?
No, it's a great question. First of all of those biographers and some others who I haven't mentioned were just incredibly supportive, and sharing, your notes and your tapes is a huge commitment, because you not only see the work, you see the stuff that got set aside, and you see the raw material. It's an act of trust, and I really appreciate that these great scholars did that with me. And in some cases, they also did point out, listen, there's stuff that you can write about now that we couldn't. David Garrow in particular spent decades protecting Dorothy Cotton's privacy. He would go around to other writers and say, yeah, we all know that Dorothy Cotton had a relationship with Doc, as Dave likes to call him, but you're not going to write about it. And he was kind of a bit of a bully on that, because as long as Dorothy Cotton was alive, Dorothy Cotton really did not want to discuss it. Dave thought it was his responsibility to keep her relationship with King private. But then once she passed away, he and other writers did begin to write what they had known all along and had kept out of the books. So, but more than that, I think these scholars are also aware that the world has changed, and that biographies are needed every generation because they reflect how we're living. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book on King is to not just correct a lot of the mythology and and sort of this hallmark version of his life, but also write a book that puts him in our time, because we're reading his story now. And I don't moralize, and I don't talk about politics, and you certainly won't see, Trump's name or discussions of today's incidences of police brutality. But I'm writing it with such a lens that I want to point out that King did talk about police brutality in the March on Washington speech, that he did talk about reparations in the March on Washington speech, so that this is a book that exists in the present as well.
Others? Questions? Yes, sir.
How much of the I Have a Dream speech was improvised? Because one of the things I think earlier delivered a speech in Detroit, I think, or I'd heard that when he was stepping up, Mahalia Jackson said, "Tell him about your dream, Martin." So is that true?
Oh man, thank you for asking that question, because this was my favorite subject. So King had written a speech, and he'd given it to reporters in advance so that they could make their deadlines. And he delivered that speech pretty much word for word. And then he got to the end, and he was told he had 10 minutes. All the other speakers had 8, so King got 2 extra minutes. But he decided 10 minutes wasn't enough. He wasn't done yet. And he said, today I want to tell you that I have a dream. And he went into that part of the speech. And some historians have reported, and Clarence Jones, who was there, claims that Mahalia Jackson thought King's speech was a little dry, and shouted out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin," because she had heard him give the dream speech in Detroit earlier that year. But when you listen to the tape, you can't hear Mahalia say that, and he goes very quickly into the dream portion, so I was a little skeptical. And I got a hold, and there was no newspaper coverage, no TV coverage mentioned Mahalia shouting, "I tell him about the dream." So I got a hold of the master Motown recording of the speech. Motown was planning to make a record. So they had a recording that was much better than the copy that's on YouTube or even the copy that's on records. And in the Motown recording, you can hear Mahalia Jackson say, "Tell him about the dream, Martin," after he has already gone into the dream portion of the speech. So she's echoing him. She's encouraging him. She's saying, "Yes, tell him about the dream, Martin." And somebody heard that, maybe it was Clarence Jones, I don't know who said it first, and just embellished it or remembered it a little bit incorrectly and made it more dramatic by saying, "Mahalia shouted that," and then, so I'm really happy that I was able to correct that small error in history in my book, even if Clarence Jones might be calling to yell at me.
Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Did your research lead you to the Martin Luther King National Historic Site in Atlanta?
Yes, I did travel to Atlanta to see the site, and if you get a chance to visit his childhood home on Auburn Avenue, it's fantastic. It's a great tour, and his sister, Christine, who's still alive at age 95, really helped them choose the furniture and the decor so that it would match the way she remembered it.
So basically you're telling me if I go down to Atlanta that I should definitely put that one.
Yes, and buy a ticket in advance because reservations are hard to get.
Yes, sir.
We just, in the Boston area, we just had a memorial in downtown in the Commons that's dedicated to Dr. King and Coretta Scott King. They met in, where they started dating, I guess, in Boston.
Like living at the
But, you know, she had to support him and the pressure of taking care of the family, worrying about her husband's life, worrying about her own life. How much in the book do you talk about her, and you know what would be missing if it wasn't that particular woman? I mean, I know that's a
No, it's a great question, and I make a huge effort in this book to give Coretta the kind of credit and attention that she deserves, because most of the other books have neglected her, and there still has not been a terrific biography of Coretta Scott King. So if there are any young writers in the room who are thinking about like what to do, I would love to see somebody, and I'd be happy to help them, just the way Taylor Branch and David Levering Lewis helped me. I will help the person who comes along to write a Coretta Scott King biography. But I want to say that the reason Martin Luther King fell in love, and I talked to 3 other women he dated in Boston, the reason he fell in love, the reason in that first date he told her, "I'm going to marry you," it was not because she was the most beautiful. She was very beautiful. It was not because she was the most brilliant. She was very brilliant. It was because she was the most experienced activist that he'd ever dated. She had gone to Antioch College, which was integrated. She had joined the NAACP on campus. She had led a protest of a barber shop that wouldn't cut black hair. She had gone to the Progressive Party's national convention, and young Martin Luther King was blown away that this woman, she didn't think he could live up to her level of expectations when it came to activism.
What did his date say was so attractive?
Oh, they said he was so charming. And he had a car. Every single woman said, and he had a car.
Yes, sir.
And they all said, oh, he was really short. Every single person I interviewed said he was really short. He was exactly my height. We have something in common.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the interview that you did with public television. So tell me why Dr. King did not collaborate with Malcolm X? I mean, why didn't, as I found out from that interview on public television, they only met once. But can you imagine what sort of power they would have had in terms of benefiting the needs of black people in this country if they collaborated? What separated them? What kept them apart?
Well, a couple of things kept them apart. One is that Malcolm X found it useful to criticize Martin Luther King. It helped embolden his followers, say, you know, we're not going to turn the other cheek. We're not going to take it. But they gradually moved toward each other. And I believe the media was trying to keep them apart. And I'll discuss that in a second because I made a discovery on that as well. But by the end of their lives, they were moving together. And when Martin Luther King was in jail in Selma, Malcolm X actually went to Selma hoping to meet him. He was down there speaking at Tuskegee, and the student said to him, you know, King is in Selma, only, you know, I don't know the distance, 100 miles away, and Malcolm got in the car with some of these students to go to Selma. He ended up meeting Coretta and speaking to her in a church and told Coretta, tell Dr. King that I am a huge supporter of what he's doing, and tell him that I hope that I might draw some fire and it would save him from some of the attack. Maybe if people realize that I'm the alternative, they'll be more likely to deal with Martin. But one thing I discovered, and I talked about how the media was in part driving them apart, and they did have their differences, obviously. Especially in the early years, Malcolm was opposed to any efforts at integration. He thought it was a waste of time. But in the most famous interview that King ever gave on the subject of Malcolm with Playboy, for Playboy magazine, written by Alex Haley, King is quoted saying, I believe that Malcolm's fiery oratory is leading to nothing but trouble. His calls for violence are divisive, and I wish he would stop. And King never said that. I got the original transcript of that interview from Haley's archives, and I found that when King was asked about the Nation of Islam, he said, I believe their fiery oratory is doing damage and their calls for violence are destructive. When asked about Malcolm, he actually said, I don't agree with everything Malcolm says, but I realize that I don't have all the answers. So he was open-minded. And Alex Haley in Playboy magazine changed that quote to make it sound that there was a conflict, that these men were antagonists. They were up against a lot, including the FBI, you know, surveilling both of them, but they were also up against the media that just wanted to create the image of division between them.
All right, this is a silly question, but I watched the Nike movie about the Air Jordan last night, and supposedly the I Have a Dream speech was handed to somebody that had a hand in developing that shoe. Is that true? And did you track that down? Did you see the hard copy of the speech? Or is that just all?
That is 100% true.
It is.
100% true.
Were you able to track that person down and see the?
I didn't go see it, but I saw pictures of the first draft. It's yeah, that was the draft that King was reading from on the podium. He handed to this guy, said, "Hey, can I have that?" And the guy went on to become a famous basketball coach and was involved with Nike.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this book. Like Bernard, I'm looking forward to reading it. I haven't read it yet. I do have a question though. You mentioned the LBJ archives, and it made me think of Caro, and there's, you know, you're doing contemporaneous research with him. I'm curious if you spoke with him, and also a little bit about your process. Like, this is a very big book. How did you decide not to write 2 books, or how do you decide what the next book is?
Yeah.
Because 6 years is long. I mean, he's taking long, but 6 years is long also. And also, what's next?
Okay, so I did reach out to Caro with some questions and with also offering to share some of the things that I found in case he hadn't found them yet, and I didn't hear back from him. I guess he's a busy guy. The process for me, there was another part of the question that I forgot already.
That's okay.
The process for me was doing lots and lots of interviews right up front, as fast as I could, and then moving into the archival research, and then beginning to write gradually. But yeah, it was a 6-year project, and I don't know what I'm doing next yet.
Following up on that question, your book is a long one, but it's got many chapters. So it's got 45 chapters. The chapters are relatively brief. There are lots of them.
So you can check Twitter and stuff there.
But clearly, you know, there was a strategy there. What was your strategy?
Well, I'm seriously.
You know, in terms of exposition, what was your strategy?
No, seriously, people have shorter attention spans these days, and I like short chapters. Even, you know, Anna Karenina has short chapters, and it makes it so much easier to get through, because you can just take a little break and check Instagram or whatever you want to do. And I just find that it also just, I want people to feel like these are scenes, that they're not getting a lot of explanation, that they're getting action. And if each chapter is a little capsule, I just think that it goes down a little bit easier. Oh, and that was your other question. Did I ever want to turn this into 2 or 3 books? When I discovered this amazing cache of papers around the Montgomery bus boycott, a team of sociologists from Fisk University went down there and captured the boycott as it was happening, interviewed all the people who were marching, interviewed Klan members, and when I got that stuff, I asked my editor if I could split this into 2 or 3 books, because I really wanted to just spend at least 200 pages on Montgomery. My editor wisely told me to stick to the plan.
Where do you write, and on what do you write? Again, just in terms of day to day, where do you do your work?
My office is in the back of my condo in Chicago. I have 2 kids at home. I had 2 kids at home while I was working on the book. One's in college now. It was the laundry room. It's still kind of the laundry room, but we moved the washer and dryer into the closet so I would have more space. And during the pandemic, it was absolute hell because there were 4 of us in that, and it's only like a 2,200 square foot condo. There were 4 of us home 24/7, and my little kid, who at that point was 8, liked to see if she could sneak up on me while I'm writing and squirt me with a water gun, because you're not actually working, you're just in there thinking. And my wife actually, you know, is on the phone all day for her job, so you can tell she's working, but you can't tell I'm working, so I'm the one who gets asked to make sandwiches. So that, I liked working from home until the pandemic came, because I had the house to myself, and then it became a big problem. And it's still a bit of a problem, because my wife doesn't want to go back to the office, but it's, we're getting used to it.
And on what do you work?
Well, I work on just a laptop, and I have just massive piles of books and folders around me. I try not to print everything out, but you know, each book is different. You know, I keep a lot of the files in Dropbox or in Google Drive, and that way it makes it easier to share them. Because one of the things I did this book more than any other is I reached out to these scholars, as I mentioned earlier, but I kept going back to them. And as I found new material, I would send it to this group of like 10 scholars and say, "What's here? What's interesting as to you?" And I would send them chapters sometimes as I was writing. If I had time, I would tell you one story about that. So Lewis Baldwin is perhaps the greatest living scholar on King's faith. And I sent him my first chapter, which was about King's parents and grandparents. And I opened with a scene where Martin Luther King Sr. and his father are taking a load of cotton to the market. And they get to the market, and the white landowner for whom they are sharecroppers tries to rip them off. And Martin Luther King Sr. complains, "Daddy, they're not giving you the right price." And Martin Luther King's grandfather tells Martin Luther King Sr., "Shut up, you're going to get us." And then that's the scene I opened with. And I sent it to Lewis Baldwin, and he said, I've used that scene in my books too, and I've come to feel like maybe it's not the right way to really describe King's ancestors, because you could make the case that King's grandmother was really more of his more important ancestor than his grandfather, because King's grandmother also suffered through sharecropping, but did not lose her faith. She continued to go to church. She continued to fight for her kids. But King's grandfather actually turned to alcohol, refused to go to church. Would you think about maybe opening your book with King's grandmother instead of his grandfather? And that really moved me. And I thought he was absolutely right. So I scrapped the whole chapter and started over. So having that network of people really helped. And I think I reached out to you a couple of times too.
Others?
Yeah.
Yes.
So how was Mr. King perceived overseas, especially in the UK?
Oh, that's a great question. Overseas, he was perceived much more warmly than he was here, and when he began speaking out on the Vietnam War, his level of esteem went up. His popularity in America plummeted in the last years of his life. He went from being one of the 3 or 4 most highly admired men in Gallup polls in 1964 to being off the list, not even in the top 10 by 1966, 67. So the rest of the world, obviously, he was awarded a Nobel Prize. He was considered a serious diplomat, a man who was qualified to speak out on issues beyond race. But when he spoke out on issues beyond race in America, he was told to stay in his lane.
Yes.
I was thinking about your comment about how it's not taught very comprehensively in school. And like even at the university level, we learn about someone or like we're reading a book, they're often picked for the teachability, I think brevity. So if you were like looking at curriculum policies, what would you tell them to read, whether it's his writings or it's about him?
I would start with the Beyond Vietnam speech. I think you could do a whole class around that, and you can teach it in history, politics, theology. But in general, let's look at his books. His books, even though he did have help writing them, they're his final word. Those are the books. He put a lot of time and effort into his books, and we don't teach them at all. And I think that's something we could really, I would love to see encouraged. And maybe there's somebody out there who can start thinking about curriculum for teaching the writings of King.
Yes.
Yeah, I was interested when you mentioned at the beginning that Carl Rowland, you think, was receiving money from the FBI.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said that. I don't
But-
know he was receiving money. I just know that the FBI was in communication with him and talking to him about trying to get him to write stories about King.
Whether he did or not, I mean, he was head of the USIA, so it's
Right.
not totally incomprehensible. But I think Carl Rowland also talked about how Thurgood Marshall was speaking to the FBI about communists in the movement. And his explanation was the movement was more important than protecting these members of the Communist Party who were very important organizers, both in the beginning as well as throughout the movement. In your research, I mean, you have all these FBI files. Have you found other connections between the FBI and movement people that, they're shake us up or?
Yeah, we've found more confidential informants within the movement than we previously knew were out there, and there's still new names being discovered. We know about Ernest Withers, the photographer, who was, we know about Jim Harrison, who was an accountant for the SCLC, but there's still more names being disclosed. And as they pass away, then the FBI declassifies those files.
Okay, but leaders?
I don't know about leaders, but I don't know if you define, Jim Harrison as leader, but he's in a position of great responsibility at the SCLC. And I'm sure there'll be more names coming, unfortunately.
I think we have to distinguish between people who were, like Withers, paid informants. I think we have to distinguish that person from Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah.
Thurgood Marshall was intensely anti-communist. I mean, he was intensely anti-communist. He was a believer in due process. He was a believer in freedom of expression. He was a good, strong liberal, but he was thoroughly anti-communist, and to that extent viewed, frankly, communists as a menace not only to the civil rights movement, but to the United States of America. But it seems to me you have to distinguish between those two sorts of figures.
I
Yes.
wonder if your research on King and the Times has led you to any conclusions about why there's such a dearth of inspirational leaders today.
Well, you can certainly make the case that we are not encouraging people to step up and take chances and lead, especially, as Harry Belafonte said to me, radicalism is frowned upon in this country now. We don't teach it, and we actively discourage it. So when you look at the way the FBI treated King and others who dared to step up and demand change, you can understand why people might be reluctant to assume that kind of leadership.
Yet there's collective movements, but no leaders emerge, or none that has the power or the influence of those times.
Well, some of that is a result of just the cultural changes. When King began his mission, 75% of Americans belonged to a church, and any given Sunday, 50% of all Americans were in church. So he had a base of power from which he could organize and motivate and activate people. And it's hard. Facebook doesn't do it.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful book. Read it.